just wrapped up my 4-year commitment to the city of Phoenix as a counselor. And so now I have some more time to be involved with this RAC. When I signed up for this commission responsibility, it kind of reflected my concern and passion about addressing climate change. It's hit me in a lot of different ways. My profession is a fly fishing guide, so I spend a lot of times on rivers and streams. So I'm directly observing the impacts that our changing climate is having on our fish populations as well as our water supplies. And also, I was unfortunate enough to be in the middle of the Alameda fire this summer, which has led to a little bit of a life change for me. And so I'm zooming in from snowy Alaska today, where it's in the teens, and there is a lot of fresh snow all around me. It's a good feeling to see again. Commissioner Lilac knew I wasn't going to be able to participate until the end of that city council term. And so here I am. And I am aware of the exciting work of this committee and look forward to learning more. And just once again, thanks to everybody. And I'm going to turn it over to Sylvia now.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate that. And thanks for being with us today. And again, this is Sylvia Chiborowski. I'm the facilitator for this Rulemaking Advisory Committee process. I'll just spend a couple of minutes going over our agenda and we can dive in. We do have a very ambitious agenda today. We're going to start with just an overview of the RAC process again, kind of just an overview from a higher level and a reminder of how your input is going to be used and the different places where your guidance will be used. And then we have kind of four topics after that. We're going to review the Equitable Outcomes version 3 that Commissioner Lilac alluded to that will be used as a guide for this process. And then we have 3 pieces on kind of the rules themselves. So one is talking about the proposed interim requirements for regional scenario planning that would apply to cities and counties that have not yet completed their regional scenario planning. And then we'll have a discussion on local performance measures, which is really, how do we measure success when it comes to climate, equity, housing, transportation, this big topic area. And then we'll circle back to looking at draft rules for regional scenario planning, which is a topic we discussed at previous RAC meetings. You'll kind of see how your input was used. And really for those big 3 topics, we're going to have plenary discussion for all of them. We're not going to break into small groups. And we're really going to be asking you, do these proposals make sense? Do these words and ideas make sense to you? Are we on the right track? Is the department on the right track? And if not, what are your concerns? What are ideas for improvements? And just a reminder that all of your comments can be made at this meeting and also through the survey that you'll be receiving a link to after this meeting, because we know that there's never enough time here to really get into the full depth discussion. And a couple of kind of process reminders and meeting packet reminders. You should have all received your meeting packets. There's a meeting summary in there, which is a summary of the last Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. If you have any comments on that, please just send those to Ingrid. Otherwise, they'll just be considered final. And we also have a public comment always as a part of those summaries. And to members of the public, which staff tries to get those into the packet as best they can, and we'll do so if they're received 3 days before a RAC meeting, at least. And another reminder just about the discussion questions worksheet. Hopefully you all had a chance to review that, RAC members, ahead of this meeting, and you'll be able to provide comments and responses to those questions after today. Members of the public, we ask that instead of using that discussion worksheet, you actually just provide comments to staff in email on any topic that's of interest to you related to this rulemaking. And then some process reminders. We have chat available for troubleshooting if you have any issues with the platform, but we hope that substantive conversation really just stays out on the table in discussion with the full RAC. And a reminder that this meeting is also being recorded, as you probably see in the corner of your screen there. And we appreciate your participation. When we have our discussion periods, we'll just ask you to raise your hand in the platform to kind of get you in the queue to speak. And we encourage you to use your video when possible, especially as you're speaking, so that we can kind of feel like we're in the same room together. But we know there are bandwidth issues and other reasons for not having your video on. And I'll just, we know this is a large chunk of your day, so get up, move around as needed, take care of yourself. We'll try to build in a break, which was not on the agenda, but we will try to take one about halfway through the meeting. All right, so that's it for just our overview of what we're going to cover today. And I will hand it over to Bill Holmstrom to give us kind of an overview of the process.
Sylvia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's Kirsten here. May I just ask, there's a new thing on my screen which says live on custom live streaming service. And I just wondered if maybe Kasseri could describe if that's the YouTube or what's that going on.
Sure, thanks, Kirsten. Yes, we are also live streaming this meeting currently on YouTube. The link is available on our website where you're able to get the meeting materials from as well.
Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. Bill Holmstrom, Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator for DLCD. Happy to be here again with all of you at the Advisory Committee. Thank you all for your time and spending it with us to move forward on this. Hopefully everyone can see the slide I'm sharing. Real quick, I'm just going to kind of, now that we're getting into kind of the meat of some of these materials, it's always, I think, good to kind of take a step back and see the big picture and what are we doing and how does that fit into everything else that we're going to be doing over the next year or so. So that's what I'm going to try to do a little bit today. And then Kevin will talk a little bit about how we're planning to take your input and make sure that it's taken into account and the different ways we're going to be able to do that. So let me just go ahead and, so yeah, kind of a roadmap, where are we going? A lot of what we're doing comes back to that charge that we talked about at the very beginning of this process, and we're going to kind of continue to come back to it, make sure that we're touching that kind of every time to make sure that we're always consistent with that charge that the Commission gave to us. And then, how Kevin's going to talk a little bit about the RAC and how we're using the guidance that you're giving us. So today, January, is that first little bit there. You'll see the things that we're going to be talking about today, and those are already on your agenda. We'll talk about that during this meeting. In the middle there, it talks about next meeting in February. We're doing a lot of following up on and kind of continuing the discussions that we're having today on performance monitoring and reporting. That's going to be something that's going to be coming back to probably a lot throughout the process. There's pieces of it that attach to the work that we're talking about now, as well as work that we're going to be talking about later on. Performance measures, and then some more draft rules that you see some in your packet today. We're going to add some more changes to Division 44 that are going to be in your packet next week as well, or next month as well. That's in February 22nd. And then the remainder of our time, March through the end of the year, transportation system and land use planning, housing and other climate-friendly strategies, and we're going to come back and make sure all that stuff connects to the things that we're talking about in the beginning of this process as well. So, if you see like the bunch of rules that are in your packet right now, don't worry about it. Those aren't final or anything. We're going to be working through those this spring. We're going to be coming back to them again in the fall. So let me just talk a little bit about kind of the big picture here of everything. If you remember the charge, there's two main categories of actions that we're going to be taking. We're really talking about the second one a lot in this spring, or this early on in this process, and that's the planning for climate reductions in the metropolitan areas, which is really on top of all the things that we're going to be doing in the first part. But it's that regional scenario planning and those interim requirements that metropolitan areas will be working on, or jurisdictions in metropolitan areas will be working on before they have to do or get into that full scenario planning. We'll be talking a lot more about that today. But there's that whole first piece of it, which I think one reason we're talking about this and having this again is because people are asking about this a lot, and like, when are we going to be talking about some of this other stuff? And that's what we called it here is climate friendly and equitable transportation planning requirements, and that's updating land use and transportation planning requirements, the existing requirements that we have in the transportation planning rules. That's Division 12 of our rules. Basically tell local jurisdictions how they have to do coordinated land use and transportation planning. It's making updates to those, making sure that we're consistent with our charge, as well as setting other land use requirements for jurisdictions. It's very similar to what we have now, it's just turning up the dial kind of on what we're doing. And just so we know, these work together, and that's part of why we're kind of going to be coming back to the second piece after we've done some work on the first piece, just to make sure that they work together very well. It's not an either or. Jurisdictions and metropolitan areas are going to be doing all these things. And then there's performance and monitoring actions that will be connected to all these things as well. So it's not just coming out of that second box. So I just want to make sure that those, that we're understanding those are connected. And then just to refresh folks' memories on what's kind of in that first box. And this isn't so much the things that we're doing, but kind of the topics of things that we're going to be doing. Making sure that we're planning for climate-friendly areas that allow high levels of mixed-use development, and making also focused transportation investments in those areas, particularly around walking, cycling, and transit. Planning for high-quality pedestrians, bicycle, and transit infrastructure, not just in those climate-friendly areas, but everywhere in communities. Limiting off-street minimum parking mandates. That's the requirements for minimum off-street parking. And just again, these are all directly out of the charge that the commission gave us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, exactly like this. Limiting motor vehicle congestion standards. This one's a little bit confusing, but I can get a little more detail later on this year when we talk about that. That's going to be a big topic for us. Prioritizing and selecting transportation projects. So it's not just figuring out good projects to do, but making sure that we're prioritizing those projects that are going to meet our climate and equity goals. And then the 6th one is supporting electric vehicle charging. Kevin, I think I'm going to hand this off to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with DLCD. So this slide is really responding to a question we've heard from a number of people, which is, how are we going to use the guidance that we're receiving from the advisory committee? We've gotten a lot, and we hope to get a lot more of your guidance as part of this process. So there's a memo in your packet. We've kind of referred to it internally as the buckets memo of like, okay, where does this stuff fall? And I'm just going to kind of lay this out for folks. So of course, the first area that we're talking a lot about are the administrative rules. You're seeing the Division 44 draft rules in the packet today. Those establish legal requirements for land use and transportation planning. They're a critical piece of the work that we're doing. They do represent legal requirements, and so in that realm, it's very important that they be written in a way that allows for clear and consistent interpretation. So that that's kind of, they have to be written in a certain legal sort of way in order to be effective. The next bucket, if you will, is the technical assistance, and this is work that the agencies do to assist local governments to meet requirements. So that can include the scenario planning process, but is not limited to that process. It could include assistance with code updates in the future. So in that capacity, DLCD and ODOT is also involved, staffers also involved in doing this kind of work. We have the ability to make sure that the processes are consistent with our goals and are consistent, of course, with the legal requirements. But beyond that, this is an area where I think we're looking to make sure processes are embedding equity, and not the only place where that's going to live, but one of the buckets in which we're going to be looking more strongly at that issue. And then the last bucket is guidance that's provided to local governments. And this is just sort of an ongoing thing that our agency does, ODOT does, includes best practice recommendations. We'll do publications to clarify, answer questions about these rules. But also, just I could imagine over time, as we move into implementing more of the work that we're doing, there may be some specific guidance documents that we may develop. One of the things that we're already thinking about is what are some good examples of inclusive and equitable sort of public involvement processes. And that might be an area where we could highlight some really great local government decision-making processes that have really embedded equity. So those are kind of the three main areas where we anticipate using the guidance from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. There's a question mark here. Are there other categories where we might be able to utilize that guidance? There may be suggestions that you all have thought of. I will say, as was noted in the memo in the packet, there is some feedback that we hear that is outside the scope of the work that we're doing. In some cases, that might be feedback that we can direct to other agencies that are working on that. But there are also maybe some input that we receive where it's really not within the scope of our efforts. But to the extent that we can, we're going to try to put things in these buckets and sort of utilize the input that you're providing in this way. So I think this is a good breaking spot. Sylvia, I'm kind of looking at you too. If there's questions or comments, is this the right place for that?
Yeah, this is it. Do you have more slides to present? Just checking.
That's it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So thanks, Kevin and Bill.
Yeah.
And that that was intended to just root us all again in the process at a high level and explain how your guidance and input will be used, and importantly, for the input that is not part of the process, how that can move forward as well. So just any questions or reflections on that, and feel free to raise your hand in the platform, find the button kind of at the bottom of the webinar bar. Let's see, Emma Newman. Oh, and also just as we're getting to know each other, just as we're still getting to know each other, if you want to just say your name and introduce yourself before your comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. This is Emma Newman with City of Springfield. Good to see everyone. I just had a clarifying question regarding the scenario planning versus the rules. Attending a commission meeting, I think it was in the fall, I thought that the regional scenario planning was going to be sequential, as in the commission would adopt the rule amendments and then the regional scenario planning for Eugene, Springfield, and the other metro areas would follow after that. But reading some of the packet materials, I'm thinking maybe it's concurrent. So I'd just like to clarify, is it sequential or concurrent for regional scenario planning?
This is Bill. Good question, and sorry if there's any confusion there. The rules will guide how local governments in metropolitan areas will do that regional scenario planning. So we have to get those adopted first before we begin implementing those. The Eugene Springfield area has a leg up, has a kind of a head start already, having done some work that was previously required, but they haven't done the adoption phase of that work yet. So that won't happen until we have the rules to. I guess there's nothing stopping some metropolitan area from jumping ahead and doing some things that aren't required of them yet, but that wouldn't be required until after the rules have been adopted later on, if that's what you're asking.
Thank you. That's really helpful to clarify.
Okay, thank you. Others? All right. Well, if there are no questions, that's okay, because the next topics are very meaty and it would be great to have extra conversation there. So I think we can probably move on to the next topic. Right. Okay, so now we're going to move into discussion of equitable outcomes for this process, and I'll turn it over to Kirsten for a little bit of framing, and then we can get a little bit of discussion.
Thank you. I think my time budget on this is 20 minutes total. Is that right, Sylvia?
Yeah, I think we're looking for maybe 10 minutes of presentation, 10 minutes of kind of discussion. Yep.
Good. I'm going to try and do better than the 50-50 and keep it short here and open it up for committee members. I wanted to also give a shout out to Steve Lee, who's joined us today. He's with the governor's office and he's a bright luminary that has helped guiding our work. He's sort of kind of our de facto chair and coach of the interagency technical support team. Steve, so I just wanted to say hello and welcome. And then also there's Amanda Peets with ODOT is on the phone, and probably Brian Hurley. So I just wanted to remind RAC members that you're supported by 7 agencies doing this work. The DLCD is, the governor asked us to be kind of front on this, but we are not doing this alone. It takes 40 RAC members and 8 agencies to pull off a magnum opus like this and to operationalize it correctly. So to Kevin's point, not everything will be in rule, but it will be in partnership, and we're going to be trying to accomplish as much as possible. I wonder if someone would do me the favor of pulling up, thank you, Evan. So last Friday, I don't know if any RAC members were listening, and Commissioner Lelek is so right. We had a robust discussion I'd like to just make sure you know that the LCDC members, I think it was Chair MacArthur's words, to make sure that everyone knew that they embrace these outcomes, and any reorganization that they're suggesting is just to make them even more actionable. Full disclosure, if you listen to that conversation, you would know that we had a previous version in their packet, unfortunately. So many of the changes that our work group made with staff, Commission hadn't seen. So they gave us some really good feedback, and some of it you had already recommended. So everyone's singing from the same page now on version 3. The problem had been that the Commission meeting packets go out more than 2 weeks in advance of Commission, and we had done our work in the interim, and I'll take the responsibility for not having sent them a supplemental of our version 3, so my apologies. But lots of enthusiasm. Chair MacArthur, Vice Chair Halova, and Commissioner Sandoval all weighed in with some great substantive feedback, Commissioner Jacobson. So the nice thing is that the Commission, even though we weren't explicitly requesting their feedback on the outcome statement, it was more show and tell, like, hey, we're so proud of these, we wanted to share them with you. But it was actually the right time in the process to share them with them, because they had such good suggestions for making these statements actionable. So you'll see that. So at the end of, when I be quiet here, we would like to get our work group, and anyone else who'd like to join together just one last time to produce a version 4 that would reflect some changes from Commission or some suggestions from Commission. And then also, I think staff under the hood, I've been suggesting that we actually diagram the outcomes specific to process, climate, and equity with respect to how they will be operationalized. Will it be through rule, technical assistance, or another tool? So we've been very serious about these outcomes, and we thank you each for helping frame them. Folks who were on that first meeting, remember, it took us an hour and a half or maybe almost 2 hours to collect your rich guidance that has ended up in these. So you'll see, if anyone was watching Commission, you'll see I was pretty defensive. I think I physically had my arms around my paper copy of the outcomes and said, like, no, these are the RAC's words, but they had some great guidance, and we'll get back to you on that. So one of the things there in the historically marginalized communities section, one of the things that is not reflected here is something we took to the Commission and wanted to get their feedback on, intended to get their feedback on, which was kind of a race forward approach to prioritizing investments associated with historically marginalized communities. And so staff had recommended, this came out of the work group, and I want to thank Michael for this observation, that we were kind of mixing our language around all over the place. Sometimes we were, talking about BIPOC community members, historically marginalized community members, a mix. And this list is a mix. So it's Black, it leads intentionally with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And that is what we recommend. And you've seen in the rule, because I know you all studied your Division 44 section of the handout, but in Division 44, so you don't have to flip there now, it's actually on page 32 and 33 of your packet. We'll get there later today, but I just want to read what we've taken from that. This is how we kind of operationalize the equitable outcomes into rule. So in the rule draft right now, it says, historically marginalized community means the following, with priority on Black, Indigenous, and people of color, with additional consideration of people with these characteristics and experiences. So that intersectional approach. So I just wanted to point that out. And if you could, Evan, just scroll down. One of our commissioners mentioned a particular concern about youth aging out of foster care. So we certainly appreciate that. It's a very, very high risk for youth to then become homeless. So we want to just note that for you. And then in the future vision statement, Commissioner Jacobson did add, and there was broad support for this. She suggested adding, so the recommendation back to you as the RAC is that on that 4th point, it says, the priority population are historically marginalized communities, including our communities, no longer bear the largest burdens of pollution, insert environmental and natural hazards, and environmental degradation. So they were concerned that there would be a call out for vulnerability to natural hazards. And I'll just go to the next page. This is not exhaustive, but I wanted to just hit the high points. Professor Sandoval, Commissioner Sandoval from the University of Oregon, he said, he said, I mean, he's very impressed with these outcomes. He said, this is going to be hard. He says, you know, from an academic standpoint, he looks at all the equity, you know, operationalizing equity literature. And he had a suggestion for us, which I appreciate, which is to kind of map these outcomes using an institutional influence strategy. So to me, I thought, aha, that is a great task for our technical support team, because we know this is not just DLCD. We know Oregon Health Authority is very concerned about when zip code being a determinant of health. We know these things matter. So we would like to get back with Dr. Sandoval and explore what he means there, what the literature says about institutional influence, to further kind of background diagram so we can defend and say back to you how we plan on working to advance and operationalize these outcomes. So I think those are just the high level feedback from Commission. Sylvia, I'll turn it back to you to quarterback any questions or comments or suggestions. And then of course, more suggestions are welcome in your survey. And if you'd like to join us in the work group, please just let us know. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, maybe we can open it up to questions and comments. And before doing that, any members of the work group have any reflections on kind of what you heard, and also Commissioner Lilac with your experience at that meeting?
No additional comments from me. Thank you. Kirsten captured it very well.
All right, thank you. Then any questions or reflections from others? Oh, Mary Kyle McCurdy.
If by the work group you meant that small group that gathered,
yes.
Right. I just want to make sure it's clear, because I don't think anyone said this, that there were just 3 of us who were part of that. We were not a particularly diverse group. So I think we all have some humility as to our input. And then of course the staff and the board commissioners have done things since then, but there were just 3 of us. So who apparently volunteered or were available then. I don't know how that came about. So thank you.
Thanks for that clarification. And Rob.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering, can you go back to the list of different groups? Are some of them there more from an intersectionality perspective, like, for example, youth and seniors, or would they on their own kind of meet this description that we're looking at in terms of who is most impacted?
Bob, that is such an important question. I just want to actually make a large container for it and say that let's carry that all the way along rulemaking process. But for the short term, for the immediate, what we propose to commission and what's in Division 44 now would prioritize, with that intersectional lens, youth and seniors who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Okay, that makes sense to me, the way you said it, but it wasn't clear to me when I was reading this.
Correct. Nothing in this document in version 3 mentioned that priority, because we hadn't taken it to commission yet. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, thanks. I appreciate that.
So you'd see that in a clarification in the next iteration. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, I guess one other comment I have is, and I have some more that I'll just put when I do my survey, but the equity outcomes, I mean, they could describe how we should improve planning for everything in Oregon. Like, it's a lot. I mean, it's great stuff, and I agree with it, but it's really, it feels like a really big lift for this process to achieve all of those outcomes. It's kind of like everything. It's kind of like a vision for equity in Oregon for planning and land use. I mean, for all planning that we do. And I kind of feel like the tools we're using in this process are not adequate to achieve those outcomes. We need a lot more tools to achieve all of those outcomes.
Thank you, Rob. And I'm going to get off the floor here, but I failed to mention Commission's suggestion that we actually diagram that list by what we can measure. And we also got into a big dialogue about what we can measure. So the technical support team is working on spatial equity and measurement and data equity. So we pushed and pulled around the importance of even things we can't measure. So please expect measurement to ride along with this container the full way. Thank you. Please back to you, Sylvia. There's a couple hands.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go to Michael and then Candace. And just a reminder to introduce yourself if you can, as we're getting to know each other. Michael?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Michael Sporluk, and I was one of the three members of the working group that was convened to work on the equity outcome statement. So one question and a little bit of a concern that I still have is that I think there is a misrepresentation of what the term intersectionality means. And maybe I will write more about this in my notes to the RAC. But the term intersectionality was coined in 1989 by a professor and scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she looked specifically at race and gender disparities and noted that there was a compounded effect for people who had both of those attributes. That said, she left the door open in terms of understanding what the compounded effects of multiple discrimination are. And so I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting anything. I believe fully that we need to lead with race, but race should not be considered a necessary dimension for intersectional work to occur. In other words, if you are a woman who is disabled, you may experience intersectional discrimination regardless of your race. Or if you are lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, plus, and you are a woman, you may be experiencing multiple discrimination or intersectional discrimination.
Thanks, Michael. And Candace.
Yes, thank you, Sylvia. My name is Candace Jimenez. I am from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and live here in Portland, work at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board. My comment was just above there in the historically marginalized communities. I just wanted to make mention or comment on the section around Indigenous people. I know that the Oregon Health Authority specifically, when referring to specifically tribes in Oregon, say tribes or tribal communities. And then when thinking about policies too, like on the federal level, there's usually the usage of American Indian / Alaska Native as well. In addition, definitely that can vary across spaces, but I know at least for Oregon, for the Oregon Health Authority, that specifically they call out tribal communities as well. So it's just another option to include, and I'll include that in my comments too, for the Native American part of the Indigenous people there.
Thank you, Candace. It's super appropriate from a government to government relations standpoint, so thank you. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Let's go to Amy and then Margie.
Thank you. Hi, this is Amy from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Eugene Springfield branch. I also had a comment about these historically underserved populations, and I noticed rural populations were missing. I understand they, experience their own special circumstances, the lack of resources, et cetera. And there are, intersections with rural populations and BIPOC populations. And I just didn't see them on this list. So I guess I was wondering if they would be considered also, if they would be considered members of this group of historically marginalized communities.
Thank you, Amy. If I could just real quick. So Amy, not to say what the RAC should do and advise on this. The reason that rural was not on here and we didn't recruit for rural per se was because of the focus on the 8 metropolitan areas here. That is why we know it's on the governor's executive order for climate, EO 2004. But for these metropolitan rules, Amy, that is why it's not on here now, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be. So please let us know what you think in the survey or come back on either way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Let's go to Margie and then Noel. And then Kirsten, I might turn back to you to just talk about the process for the work group, kind of next steps on that, and then we can move into the next agenda topic. Margie?
Hi, thanks. And it's Margie with a hard G. That's okay. This is a huge rulemaking committee. So yeah, hi, I'm Margie with a hard G, Margie Broadway from Metro Regional Government. And I have a couple remarks. First, I just want to say thank you to all the staff that worked on this. The materials are really impressive, and I like how everything is bucketed both in the outcomes and the rulemaking. And so great job. It's easier to understand. Metro is supportive of the changes to the rule, asking Metro to do climate smart in perpetuity, I believe, continue to do it beyond. And so I appreciate those changes. But I wanted to speak quickly to the issue of outcomes and how they relate to performance measures. I strongly believe that the performance measures should be driven by the outcomes that you want and not by the data available. And the reason why is I think Metro struggles with this. We have strong climate goals. We have strong equity goals. Our data is imperfect, but we continue to work at it. And we keep our goals and our performance measures the same. And I think if DLCD and other transportation and land use professionals are working towards the same goal of bettering the data to support the performance measures, I support that approach, as long as it's recognized when the performance measures are made that the data needs improvement. And that's something that we're going to have to do as a next step. So I encourage that thinking as we continue to link these outcomes towards performance measures.
Yeah. Thank you, Margie. And Noel.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly, Noel Johnson with the Oregon Smart Growth, the complex real estate development group representative. With respect to the socioeconomic comments and groups here, it seems like it might be helpful to differentiate better between low income and low wealth. You can have someone who has median family income and negative wealth because they have $50,000 student loan debt. And the experiences and the opportunities and the frustrations and how these rules ripple through once they're 10 years hence are entirely different than, for example, a person of similar income who might be 30, 40 years older and at that society funded education. Like, we don't do that anymore. And so I think wealth is entirely different and has very different trajectories and implications. And we as a society have only usually focused on income to our detriment. So clarity there and how that implies and affects like our equitable outcomes, I think is really rather entirely missing. And so I think that could be helpful to add some clarity there, some discussion there.
Thanks, Noel.
Yeah, thank you. And Kirsten, maybe just back to you quickly on next steps or the work group reconvening.
You bet. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, Sylvia. Paige West would like to speak as well.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Paige.
Thanks. Paige West, Rogue Valley Transit. It seems like from the PowerPoint that Bill showed previously, where it called out that investments such as bike, ped infrastructure, and transit would be more fairly allocated to historically marginalized communities. I'm not really seeing that in this document. Looking through it now, for the third or fourth time, I'm not really seeing the funding, investments, that resources for building bike ped or transit service will be invested in these areas. And so that to me seems to be like a very specific outcome that gets to the heart of what it is that we're trying to do. And it should be kind of front and center, in my opinion.
Thanks, Sylvia. If I can just take that and wrap up. Paige, thank you. That is astute, because I think we're just so close to it we forget, but that is the point. So thank you. You should just say it a little bit more plainly there rather than waiting on bringing it out in rule. So that's a great improvement. So One last just recognition before I totally close here. I think I keep looking at Patricia, and I think maybe Patricia, you are representing ARP today for Bandana. And I just wanted to welcome any other alternates who are in a primary seat today for their prime. And that would probably be helpful for Sylvia to know. Patricia, is that the case?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you for being here today. Are there any other, Sylvia, maybe we should check if there are any other alternates that are here for their prime today in that seat? Maybe that's it. Okay, thanks, Patricia. Okay,
Wade Elliott is here for the City of Grants Pass. I'm standing in for Brad Clark.
Thank you, Wade. Thanks for joining. Awesome. Appreciate you making the time.
Thank you.
Okie doke. All righty. So as Mary Kyle alluded to, we welcome, we went with the group of the willing who had volunteered to serve on the Equitable Outcomes, and we just like to reopen that. It certainly doesn't need to be the same 3 hardworking members. So if anyone would like to convene with us to talk about income versus wealth and other things, I think that was just a very astute remark, and so deserves some more discussion. So if any primary or alternate would like to join us, please go ahead and just let Ingrid Caudell know. You can respond to your meeting invite or your packet, or respond in your survey, and we will schedule accordingly. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sylvia.
All right, thank you very much. All right, then I think we'll move into the next topic of regional interim planning requirements. And so here we'll have Cody provide a little bit of background. I think we have about 10 or so minutes for presentation, and then about a 20-minute rack discussion. And really, we're going to be asking you whether the proposal that you see here, primarily for monitoring and reporting framework, makes sense. You know, is it on the right track? Do you have any major concerns, or do you see any places where it could be improved? And again, welcome any comments here and also in the survey after this meeting. So with that, I will turn it over to Cody.
Hey, thanks, Sylvia. Hey everyone, this is Cody Meyer, planner with Department of Land Conservation and Development. So I just want to take a couple minutes to go through part of the memo. It is item 6 in your packet, or page 16 of the PDF. And just kind of go through that a little bit. These next kind of topics we're going to be discussing, I think of them as kind of like the first pass. So Paige, great comment, much more to build on. And I think that we'll just be continually building on a lot of this stuff as we kind of go along here through the next year. So what you're seeing here, the orange box, that's the concept that we described in December, and that was the required regional scenario planning that Matt will be talking about in those rules, Division 44, that we've rolled out to you. And so what we're going to be talking about in this little section here is just this blue box. And sorry for the different colored boxes. We are, I think, in the yellow box from the Bill's slide in the beginning. But this would be the interim regional planning requirements. And the reason we're talking about this is that we really need funding and technical resources to do this work for the local governments. And so we realized in scoping this rulemaking that in the near term, we had budget and time to do scenario planning in full for, picking up Salem, Kaiser, and Eugene, Springfield areas. And so what we're going to be talking about is some interim requirements before people have a chance to get to that. And so this would be for Albany, Bend, Corvallis, Grants Pass, and the Rogue Valley areas. And so the purpose here is to talk about regional goals or regional actions that would link local actions to the statewide transportation strategy and its vision for greenhouse gas reductions, and linking those to the actual work of local governments. So a lot of those things that are in the STS are very high level. They're for the region. They're not for the city in the region as they stand now. But they serve as what I like to think of as guideposts or goal areas for the regions to work on. And so those can be used to inform the suite of local action-based performance measures we'll talk about in the next section coming up here. So this is just kind of how do we monitor and report on where we are going in a region to meet our state greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so those would be used in both. The orange box would be the region and the cities work together to come up with a plan, and they say we have a customized suite of actions that we want to go ahead and do that would reach our performance target for the greenhouse gas reductions. In the blue box, we have from the STS a really good idea of where regions need to be at to meet those reduction targets. And so we use those as just a monitoring, like benchmarking. In either case, those are used to perform how high the suite of actions would have to be at the local level. And so I think in the next slide here, I think I might just have one slide. Yeah. So this is the STS. I don't want to go through this. This is like a fire hose here, but just to give you an idea of, these are the actual trajectories in the STS vision. This was adopted by the state. It was a coordinated effort among many stakeholders to produce this document. But these are the kind of regional actions that we're talking about. And so we have, anything from daily parking costs to the percent of workers that participate in a transportation demand management program, just a lot of stuff. And I think what you might notice here is that some of these don't really have like a very local action-based lever to them. And the bicycle on the second row down is a good one. It's kind of an outcome of a local action. And so we can't say the city of Eugene is meeting this by what they are doing on the ground. So they're striping bike lanes. They're not diverting people. So what we talk about in the local measures is, what are the actions that we want cities to be working on, and how much of that action do they need to do? So next slide, please, Bill. So just to give a finer point on that, so again, looking at that bike or light vehicle diversion, and light vehicle refers to scooters or hoverboards or whatever kind of thing that is basically not a car that you can use to get around on. And here you can see that we have from the STS kind of divided these into the size of the metropolitan area. So the large MPO would be Metro. I believe the medium is Springfield, Eugene, and Salem Kaiser areas, and then the small are the other 5 MPO areas. So we have these, what we call trajectory. As the line goes up the graph, we need to be doing more of this stuff. We need to be getting more people out of their cars and onto light vehicles. And then in the little circles I put in is, we can set benchmarks with those. And so we can use this information to actually set performance benchmarks that would be used to inform the local performance targets. So I think I'm just going to take some time to answer any questions. I'm really hoping this is kind of coming clear, but I realize that we have a lot of information to convey in a short amount of time. So I'll open up the floor to any kind of questions or discussion you guys would like to have.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And just because I get to ask the stupid questions as a non-planner in the room, can you remind the group here what jurisdictions what you just talked about applies to? Because it was for the, yeah.
So this was going to be for Albany, Bend, Corvallis, Grants Pass, and the Rogue Valley areas, which is essentially everything from Medford down to Ashland and in between.
I think that's helpful. Yeah, and so I think just any questions, clarifying questions are welcome, and just any reflections on whether what you're seeing here seems to be on the right track, or any concerns or places where you see there could be improvement. And I see a hand up from Mary Kyle.
Hi, thanks, Cody. It's still a little amorphous to me, and I think you're trying to take us through it step by step, but looking at the graph that you showed us on a slide that's also on page 20 of the PDF that says, the categories, the STS vision, regional trajectories. I personally it still doesn't have any numbers in it. It just says percentage population in mixed use areas, electric vehicle charging availability. So is what you're proposing like a more completed chart that would actually say what the STS performance measure is, what the local performance measure or objective outcome is, I should say, I think performance outcome is, and then the local actions that they fill in? I feel like I'm only kind of seeing half the cake here, not the full cake or some other metaphor.
Yeah, well, it's a good one. So yes, you're only seeing the sponge of the cake for you British baking show enthusiasts. So yeah, what we're trying to do is kind of take these in bite-sized chunks because it's a lot. And so right now we're kind of talking categories of things. But I think to answer your question, yes, we do have numbers behind those STS trajectories that we can use for setting of benchmarks. So these are the actions. And to throw that table out there would be kind of a lot. So we're just kind of taking it in the content.
But eventually, and I think maybe this goes back sort of to the diagram question, maybe that the commission asked, maybe that Kristen described, sorry. But there'll be STS numbers filled in, then there will be performance outcomes, and then who that LCDC will fill in for the regions, and then there'll be local actions or something like that that's going to be a local thing. I mean, it's just still trying to get who does what when, and that seems a little amorphous here, I think.
Yeah.
And so who's setting each of these?
So in the regional section that we're talking about, we have a kind of a finite list. What you see on page 20 of the PDF and the document, that is the list from the STS. Those are the regional goals or trajectories of actions that have numbers behind them,
right?
That we can use. The problem is that we don't have a who's responsible for a region outside of Metro, right? We're looking at coming up with kind of action-based local stuff that we'll talk about next. And so what we're talking about in this regional piece is we are going to be using these as monitoring and reporting guideposts and goals to set those local performance measures, right? So if we say, I'm just going to keep picking on bicycle. Right. If we know that you have to be increasing your mode shift to 30% from 10% or 2%, we know that that is a sizable gap to be making. There's like a lot of emphasis has to be placed there. What we don't have right now is the information that says how many miles of bike lane or bike path equal that mode shift. And so some of this we're going to have to come to in the next couple of years to kind of crosswalk those two, if that's making sense, to say, okay, this is where your performance benchmarks for striping bike lanes and building bike paths and all the infrastructure actions for the cities within the region would have to, go up by 10, 20% each year.
Right. So the next column, though, would then be DLCD or in this rule or something. This is what I'm trying to sets what those are. I'll just assuming for the sake of argument here that bike miles, striping bike miles is a good way to reach that mode split, which I don't necessarily agree with, but let's just say that's it.
Right.
But the next column would be DLCD's rules set this mode thing, and then there's local actions. I don't want to belabor too much of this because there's lots of other people in this rack, but I realize you don't know what that number is, 35 miles or whatever it is, but or percentage increase or whatever, but it's just, how do these parts fit together? That was the hardest part of reading this packet for me.
Right. And I think some of that we're going to be coming back to in February to talk about monitor and reporting. And that's where we're going to be fleshing out a little bit more of how do we adopt that? Is it a schedule in the rule? How do we make these into tangible, the other column you're referring to?
All right. Thank you. And Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Warnicki with the City of Salem. And I just wanted to confirm that these interim rules you're talking about would not apply to for example, Salem-Kaiser, because we're going to be going into the scenario planning route. And the reason I'm asking is because when you read your documents, it appeared to me that it said that these would apply to jurisdictions before they have adopted a preferred scenario plan. And obviously it's going to take some time to get to adopting a scenario plan. And so I was wanting to make sure that we weren't going to be required to do these rules and then, 2-3 years later, switch to some other rules.
Yeah, the intent was for the other 5 metropolitan areas to go directly to this tract, and that for Eugene, Springfield, Salem-Kaiser, and then Portland Metro have the other tract, which is they develop a scenario plan and they come up with their own customized levels of ambition for the same actions, because that's what is in the scenario planning tool. So it's not intended to do both for you.
Thank you.
That's helpful. And Jana.
Thank you. Cody, this is just a quick question. I think when you were referring to bicycles and scooters and things, you called them light vehicles. Am I correct? Is that the terminology you used?
Yeah, and I'm sorry about that. I think that is kind of some of the language is evolving, but it's like micro mobility, or light vehicles does refer to things like passenger vehicles. So I'm sorry that was a typo on my part. Yeah, it was not intended to be passenger vehicles.
Right. So I was going to suggest we come up with a different term of art, because in the ODOT world that references passenger vehicles. So I was just concerned about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And that was my typo on that slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And others, any other questions or reflections on how this information went for you? Any thoughts on this proposal for monitoring and reporting? Kari?
Thank you. Thanks, Cody, for the overview and for all the information in the packet. My question, and maybe this will be something that we get to later in the meeting, but just looking back on the trajectories that were laid out in the STS and seeing where we are today, that we have not made the kind of progress that we need to make. And so I'm wondering, how what is being proposed is different than what the current process is, what the differences are there. I noted that you talked about benchmarks, and I think that's seems like an intriguing way to potentially be able to move things forward and, have pause points during the process. And I would hope that is applied to all of the regions. But I guess my overarching question really is, what's being proposed that's different here than what was already existing in the STS before, or in the transportation planning rule, or other policies that have been laid out in the past? Thanks.
Well, it's a great point. Certainly, we've been losing pace on, doing a lot of this work. And so I think that we all realize that not only do we need to do more, but we have to do even more just to pick back up from all the slacking we've been doing as a state. And, well, people in general, sorry. I think that my own opinion on that is these are laudable goals. They're aggressive. They're going to be, we're going to have to kind of put shoulder to the wheel, as Kirsten would say, to get there anyway. And I think that our charge and what our commission wants us to do is to act with a sense of urgency. And so this will probably be an iterative process in this program. And this is something that we can work on over time to go back and monitor what's happening and adjust as necessary. But for now, we know that we're going to have to do a lot just to get to these benchmarks and these targets for these actions. And so that we should probably stay focused there. We have a lot of great work that we can kind of capitalize on. And so I think, I don't know if I answered your question or not, so.
Yeah, not entirely, and I think
Okay.
maybe it'll be something that we get to, but I think it's definitely something that I feel like is a really important point that underlines the work that we're doing here. Is, what are we changing? What are we doing different so that we can actually meet these goals and be more effective than we have been? And I don't fully see that in this document yet, but I will continue to keep asking.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, thank you for the reminder on the second part of your question. That, I think a lot of that stuff is going to come in the second part of this rulemaking, where we start making, directives in the TPR and the housing rules. When we're talking about kind of like planning processes, they're good, but not great, is how I would phrase it. And so we do have a lot of work there, and we have to do, I kind of think of that as kind of the supporting work to get to those greenhouse gas reduction rules. That we know we have to do a lot, but this is kind of just talking about the planning framework, which is a little bit more long range and visionary. And so you're not going to see the direct component that you're looking for.
Yeah, thank you. And this is in the chat, but just a reminder for folks that STS stands for the Statewide Transportation Strategy, in case anyone's lost on that term. And Kari, I appreciate your comments. And I also just want to point out, I think, the comments asking like, what has already changed? What's different? Those are really good questions. And in this discussion or in your survey, it'd be helpful to hear, what do you want change? Where are the places where you want to see change from what's been done in the past, to help provide that input as we move forward? See a couple more hands up. So Sarah and then Paige.
Hi. Yeah, I think this might kind of build on what Kari was saying too. So I'm Sarah Adams Shane. I'm at the University of Oregon School of Law, and I'm, in terms of the interim, I'm really wondering, thinking about benchmarks, but also accountability, and that there is this performance gap that's ever widening in terms of meeting goals. And really, performance gaps typify most climate change law and policy implementation, throughout the country and really throughout the world. So we know that that's kind of where we are and where we're headed, without significant change. So so we have that, and then on the other hand, we have the severity of the problem, and we also know that the burdens from increase in climate-related risks significantly disproportionately BIPOC and other communities with less political power and less wealth. So I just would like to see, in terms of what I'd like to see, really any way that we can increase and be clear about accountability throughout, for both tracks that we work on.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And Paige.
Yeah, Paige West, RVTD. I think that the way that I'm looking at this is that the smaller MPOs, which I'm part of one and have gone through performance monitoring now for, over 15 years. It seems like this is almost just a light version of scenario planning, by requiring that we go through a gap analysis and we identify what that gap is, what the investment is, what the strategies are for adopting new goalposts, as you're calling them. It sounds like scenario planning, and I'm just curious if it's being depicted in this way so that it's maybe more acceptable to these smaller MPOs. So I'm kind of concerned that it's just basically scenario planning, and that the way that it was described in the beginning of this process is that there's only a certain amount of resources available for DLCD to do this work, and that you're going to be prioritizing the larger MPOs to finish basically and adopt their preferred scenario. So is this work happening in tandem at the same time over the next 1 to 3 years? And if so, it seems like it's pretty lofty. That's ambitious to be doing both of those efforts at the same time. But also, if we're not going to be, required to adopt the performance measures in these smaller MPOs, I think it's, it's worthy to go through the process, but it seems like we're basically being asked to work with the performance measures that we have right now. And in the RVMPO area, we've been very good about reporting, actually. We've been one of the best. So we are working on that and have been accountable, but that we're going to have to adopt a second level of performance measures that are basically an interim set, and then possibly actually go through a formal, scenario planning, maybe in 4 or 5 years, and have to adopt a whole new set. So I think it's a lofty goal for you at TLCD, and I think it's probably overly ambitious and asking a lot of the smaller MPOs on our side. So I'm wanting to seek some more transparency here on what it is that you're asking.
So I think you're right to categorize it as scenario planning light. It does not have an adopted plan, so it is much lighter than a scenario plan. What it is essentially is a reporting framework. We have goals. We're supposed to be on bike day version. We're planning on sending consultant support and staff support to help start measuring where we are today and where our plans would take us if adopted tomorrow. And how does that stack up to where we know we should be to be meeting our climate pollution reduction goals? And I think that the other performance measures you're referring to are your existing transportation planning rules, measures that you guys have been, you're right, you guys have been doing great work on that. And so what I believe we're proposing is to update those performance measures with what the next topic will be with those local performance measures. And then those would be adopted and used as the accountability mechanism. But this reporting regime that we're talking about here is kind of doing that first step of the scenario planning, of just looking at where are you today, where are your plans projected to take you, and then what changes would you have to make to reach these greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so in that way, it's just kind of a gap analysis. Sarah mentioned it, that we're kind of daylighting the gap between where we are and where we need to be.
And the only other thing I'd add to respond to Paige is that it's the ODOT DLCD bucket of resources that I think that you were referring to, Paige. So it's ODOT has resources in its climate office to support implementation of both these and then also scenario planning. But thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
I was just asking if this work would be done, when? Is it 2022, 23? Is it happening at the same time as the larger MPOs? And, it's months worth of work going through it with you, Cody, actually, during the strategic planning that we did here. There's a lot of staff work for me and at the city level and for DLCD to do what was really considered also to be scenario planning, light. So, there was just a little snippet about the consultant work and whether or not ODOT would be in charge of a contract that would hire consultants to help us, or if it would be something that we would procure at the local level, or if it's DLCD staff themselves. I would really suggest that you start thinking about that now, and making it consistent and really providing us with the resources from a procurement standpoint, or if it's going to be your staff starting to staff up for that, because it's a lot of work. So if it's going to be at the same time, wow, that's a lot of work for you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I saw Brian Hurley from ODOT raised his hand. So Brian, would you like to chime in here?
Thank you, Cody. I appreciate it. Yes, this is Brian Hurley from the Oregon Department of Transportation in the Climate Office. I just wanted to jump in and add to what Kirsten had said. And here in ODOT, we have identified the approximate need in order to make this happen. I wouldn't characterize it that we've identified all of the resources to make this happen yet. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And that is captured in the one of the scenario planning needs memo that was delivered to this RAC at the first meeting, I believe. Cody can correct me on that one though.
That was part of the scoping for this rulemaking. So that was a memo that the two agencies put forth to LCDC in September of 2020. And we identified this as an option that we'd like to pursue.
Thank you for the correction.
Cody, do you mind if I jump in there too?
Absolutely.
So this is Amanda Peets. I'm the director of the ODOT Climate Office. So Brian works for me.
Thanks, Amanda.
So
I appreciate
it. Couple thoughts on these pieces. So to add to what Brian was saying, and to your question directly, Paige, when we looked at what it would take in terms of resources and staff support, we looked at a spectrum. And that spectrum ranges from how scenario planning was done in the Portland metro area, which is a pretty large and significant effort, to kind of more the strategic assessment work, which is what was done in your area, Paige, and Corvallis and some other areas, which is technical, still a fair amount of work behind it, but not necessarily a lot of that public process piece, to kind of a simple performance measures approach. Because what we wanted to do is not get ahead of this committee's work, kind of see where you all thought was the right direction in terms of level of effort to go, and to try to resource accordingly. So our thought on this is that we can do no more than 2 areas at a time, especially if we're in kind of that higher level of effort. So from an agency capacity and funding perspective, that's probably where we're at. So there's no way, even if we did kind of a lower level of effort, I think that we'd be doing all areas simultaneously. I just don't think that's really in the cards for us. Another thing I wanted to add, just since I have the podium real quick, Kari, you asked a really good question about what changes. And I think a couple things that we've learned from this previous work that we've done is the existing plan can help get us closer to a greenhouse gas target. I think we all know that existing local plans, cities and counties, probably don't have the money they need to implement all those pieces. So no matter what, one of the biggest challenges we're going to have to really make this successful in the end is the tools in which we employ to fund these things and to prioritize things. It requires a pretty significant shift from jurisdictions in their thinking. The benefit in doing the planning work is it highlights to jurisdictions what opportunities they have, and to be able to discuss what might be palatable to them, what things to do, maybe what things wouldn't work in their area, and to customize that because we recognize every jurisdiction is different. But in the end, to get to different and significant results, I think we need to talk not just about how we measure and track things, but how we also fund and get behind and support some of these actions, either individually or collaboratively.
One more chime on, if I could point of clarification. So Paige, your call to action is a good one. And in addition to the resources that the ODOT Climate Office, we're pleased that Governor Brown's recommended budget did include additional resources. It's still small compared to ODOT's resources, but one additional staff person. And I believe that was, I should get back to folks on the exact numbers, but I believe it's $1 million for local technical assistance. So that goes into the legislative forum now, and but that was a request. We basically, everybody, this will need to be a multi-year funding strategy for the good next decade. So, no, but Paige, you're so right to raise the issue.
Thanks, Kirsten, Amanda, Brian, Paige, for those questions and clarifications. I see a couple more hands up. I do want to make sure that you all get to have a break. So quickly, Margie and Noel, and then we'll try to give you all a break before we move into performance measures.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick. Again, Margie from Metro. I know what Metro did in the scope and scale is not transferable to my colleagues in smaller MPOs. We did have an influx of funding for the first Climate Smart, but in our 2018 update of the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan that's federally required, we tried to really combine the Climate Smart process update with the RTP. And so my advice for the smaller MPOs is our ongoing climate work. We look for integration with existing federally required planning efforts. And I think that could be highlighted by DLCD staff a little bit more in these documents, that the RTP, at least in our region, is the place where we have the hard conversations about priorities, policies, and projects. And so it fits well with Climate Smart or with climate inequity.
Thanks, Margie. If I could just, people kind of sometimes use MPO as shorthand for metropolitan areas. It stands for Metropolitan Planning. Oh, it's okay. It stands for Metropolitan Planning Organization. It's a federal requirement for metro areas to do these RTPs, or Regional Transportation Plan. That is something that we've waded through for years, and we, those of you who serve at MPOs will notice we are not talking about MPOs. We're talking about cities and counties in metropolitan areas, because it's been very clear that that's not something that our rules would really directly apply to. And we want to be flexible in that approach, and we want to do everything we can to say, if you would like to do it through your MPO, if you'd like to do it through your regional plan, that is great. We would love that. But I think it was a little too difficult for us to make a one-size-fits-all approach. And so we are being a little bit more agnostic on that aspect. But I think there are a lot of things we can do to make sure that that seems like a great place to do it. And the timing of the cycles of reporting and things that, like you guys are doing with your RTP, that's something we looked at in 2018, and we can bring forward on this effort as well.
Thanks, Cody, Margie. And Noel.
Yeah, just on the issue of scale and funding, I just want to remind, like, the city of Portland specifically needs to have over $1 billion per year of funding into new housing, simply to keep up with the average amount of housing that has been created over the past 20 years. And so from a sense of scale, I say that because it helps us understand that, like, only through the private market funding, if we both incentivize it, maybe regulate it, a combination of sticks and carrots, can we even get close to, from a climate change perspective, get close to the effect that we're needing to see as a society. So I just wanted to kind of, from the developer in the room, remind people at the scale, that's just for housing, just in the city of Portland, right? And we span that out to the state, the numbers get way beyond any sort of normal thinking about funding. So hopefully it's helpful.
That's a good comment. And I think, Margie, what you guys did with your climate smart communities was a good example of making the business case to get those investments, particularly in transit, that it was, I think in the billions to get there on the transit piece. And from what I understand is making very good progress on transit and the funding there. So that is one of those kind of aspects where it doesn't sound really great like accountability does, but making a business case and daylighting the gap of, like, we need to get money for transit to get there. We have a long way to go. I think could make a lot of headway. Hopefully.
Thanks, Cody. It's been a really great discussion. And just a reminder that additional comments are always welcome through the survey after today's meeting. I think we'll go ahead and take a break here, maybe a 10-minute break, and get back together at 2:35. And at that time, we'll get into discussion of the local performance measures. So feel free to turn off your camera, put yourself on mute, but don't leave the meeting. And we'll see you again at 2:35.
I wrote a note to myself, to Jim, to bring
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you all are back here, even if you're not on screen. So we're going to keep going with our meeting here, and next we're going to talk about local performance measures. So really measures to help reduce carbon pollution with an equity lens. And I'll hand it over to Cody to give some framing and presentation. And I think we're looking for about 15 minutes-ish of presentation and then 35 minutes of discussion by the group to try to stay on schedule here and get your input. So Cody, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. So hello again. We're going to kind of switch down a level from the regional and talk kind of city level now. And so I'm going to be talking about the performance monitoring concept memo, which is sometimes labeled item 7 or page 23 of your packet. And just want to kind of frame it with that we're looking for monitoring and reporting on actions necessary to plan for the climate-friendly and equitable communities in this rulemaking. And so the purpose of these performance measures would be to enable local governments to monitor and assess whether key elements or actions are being implemented and whether the plans and public investments are achieving the expected outcomes of creating those climate-friendly and equitable communities. So these local performance measures are intended to be much more detailed than those using that regional monitoring framework that we just talked about. But they are meant to complement those measures by, measuring the actions that cities can take to meet these regional goals. And, we can look at how we're going to do this and how does this fit into the equity framework that we're discussing. And so if we can go to the next slide, we can talk about this as kind of a two-tiered approach that we're presenting here. So the first tier is really kind of identifying and mapping the historically marginalized communities. We made mention of this technical support team, a group of, I think, like 7 agencies and the governor's office that will be supporting this rulemaking and looking at actual mapping tools to help support local governments. We know that to do this, local governments are going to need a lot of support. And so the plan is for us to roll out that technical assistance and tools to get this work done, to make it very easy to do. Given that we know that some of this stuff can be kind of mind-boggling once you get in and start doing it. But so we'd start with centering on equity and identifying those communities. Then the second tier is looking at what are the actions that cities and counties can take to reduce carbon pollution? And so if we're looking at just transit, what we know we have to do 4 times more transit in your city. And so the sweet spot here in prioritization would be the overlap of these benefits as they're given to historically marginalized communities, kind of working your way out and prioritizing the benefits. And so this approach is really centered on the need for significant increases in the actions that are necessary to reach our climate pollution reduction goals, but in a way that prioritizes the benefits and minimizes the harms for historically marginalized communities. I think that we proposed starting with the performance measures that we developed in 2018 in the transportation planning rules. That was something that we never got to the adoption phase, but we worked for months with a subcommittee of city, regional, state staff and input from the Oregon Model Steering Committee, who does a lot of the transportation analysis in the state, to develop a set of recommended performance measures that would really get at increasing transportation choice and also reducing carbon pollution. And so we wanted to kind of honor the work that group put in, a lot of hours on those, and we thought that they're a pretty good starting place for discussion, but obviously open to talking about those and coming up with new data sources. So for today, I think we just kind of want to look at, are we measuring the right things? Are we talking about the right actions? Is there something we're missing here? Is there something maybe we shouldn't have on that list? And then we can kind of dive into that and say, what are the data sources? How do we define something like a bike lane? Any one of these things you can kind of tear apart to various pieces once you get into it. So for now, we just wanted to put these on the table. And we do have more information as to what kind of defines some of this stuff that we developed. If anyone's interested, we're happy to share that as well. So this is the list of performance measures. The categories are bicycle, land use, pedestrian, transportation demand management, or TDM. Those are programs that really kind of inform people as to what maybe their options are for commuting that doesn't involve a car, or giving benefits such as free transit passes or something like that. And then transit and streets. So reconfiguring streets to incorporate more modes of transportation other than the automobile. And I think I'll probably just cut it short there and maybe just get the discussion going early.
Okay, thanks, Cody. And maybe before we get into discussion on this, just any clarifying questions? Is it kind of clear how these performance measures would be used? Did anything not make sense? Were there any acronyms that need to be explained? Leanne? And a reminder to just introduce yourself too as we get to know each other.
I didn't need any clarification. I just had some comments on the performance measures, so I would defer to anyone who needs clarification on that first, and then I'm happy to provide any input.
Okay, then maybe just a second. Give it a second for clarifying questions. I want to make sure this makes sense to everyone. Julie?
Can you remind people what the bicycle level of stress is and how that applies here?
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize, some of these can be kind of wonky. So the bike level of traffic stress is a measure of basically how comfortable is it to ride your bike on a street. So if you can think of the biggest arterial that goes through your town and how you might feel riding your bike down there with your 6-year-old versus your kind of neighborhood street, which has a much lower speed and volume of traffic, and that would have maybe a bike lane or a protected buffer or something like that. So it kind of just measures what the user experience is on the facility based on some different criteria. And I'm not an expert in it, so if you anyone else has a better explanation than that, I'm happy to open it.
I just wanted to ask, I mean, maybe this isn't the right time, but is this something that ODOT would be doing, ODOT or DLCD would be doing the analysis for, or is this something you would be looking to the locals to do the analysis on?
So in 2018, as it was proposed, it was optional. It was something that we recognized that a lot of the bigger cities in the metropolitan areas have already done this work with ODOT. They have specialists there. And so we thought that there's some different ways you can turn that into a metric, and that's good. But we do realize that that's not going to work for a lot of smaller jurisdictions or for people that don't have the budget to do that. And so it was an optional measure.
All right,
would it still be optional, Cody, as you're proposing it right now? Sorry, this is Kirsten. Would it still be optional? And if not, then who to help the local governments with that capacity building?
Yeah, I think it's part of the discussion. I certainly think we should start with it being optional as it was proposed in 2018 and see how the group feels about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And are the hands up from Rob and Jan, are those clarifying questions?
Not for me, I can wait.
Yes, mine is.
Okay, okay, go ahead, Jana.
It's just in relationship to a statement Cody just made, and that is, you're talking about levels of stress and how you define those. If that application has already been made, are there standard definitions that local governments can use from one local government to another, or are they subjective?
I believe that they are standard, but it's not my area of expertise. So I think that we could reach out to someone at ODOT and get some more information to bring back to the group.
Unless Brian or Amanda wanted to respond now, Cody.
I'd be curious to know more about that. So thank you.
So I'll make a note to send out to the group some more information on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want, I could share real quickly. So there is some guidance that's been provided at ODOT and through local jurisdictions and figuring out a standard approach for bicycle level of traffic stress so that it would be a set methodology that everybody applies and applies in the same way. So in that way, it's set up and structured. I think the idea behind a lot of these measures would be figuring out how much they can be done independently by each jurisdiction versus where there might need to be a little bit more state level support. I think at a minimum, we recognize that we need to set some clear guidelines if it will be more independent to jurisdictions to be clear kind of how to do things or, you know, helping to provide some consultant support for those.
Well, I appreciate that because if it's subjective and it's done differently from one region to the next or one local government to the next, then the data is less useful. Thank you.
Great point. Thank you.
All right, thanks all. So let's move into discussion. And Leanne, before I call on you, just a little bit of framing here. I think really what would be most helpful is just your reflections, thinking about what Cody just presented. Do you think this proposal for the performance measures approach makes sense? Is it on the right track? Any concerns or any places where you see improvement? And do you have suggestions for other performance measures that could kind of get to both equitable outcomes and reductions in carbon pollution? And I also want to point out in the conversation we just had before our break, it was understandably, you know, a conversation that was more geared towards planners, cities, counties that are outside of the larger metro areas. But for this conversation, we really also want to hear from those who represent historically marginalized communities and have that lived experience and kind of your reflections on these performance measures. Even if it seems technical, you know, those ideas, more general ideas would be really helpful from your lived experience.
It might be nice then,
So
Sylvia, to go ahead and have those remain on the screen for people to consider them as the discussion goes. So Cody, if you could bring those back. Thanks.
Perfect. All right, let's go to Leanne and then Rob.
Great, thanks. My name's Leanne O'Neill. I'm with Bend Bikes and Allyship in Action in Bend, Oregon. So some of my initial reactions were, especially in particular around the bicycle and pedestrian performance measures. Linear feet of all bike projects implemented really doesn't change anything on the ground. As someone who bikes year round, our biggest issues are where we have a high density of people. And that's where we have the least amount of cycling infrastructure. So you can build miles and miles and miles of cycling infrastructure in the outskirts of town, and it's not going to actually encourage anyone to switch to that mode of transportation. And then I'll just note, I know that the city of Bend did an LTS map, and there was a set methodology for it where, you know, like LTS 1, level traffic stress number 1, was supposed to allow children of all ages to be able to ride. And even with really clear guidance, sometimes the actual application, we had a little bit of a disagreement around which streets were being designated as safe for children of all ages. I would say similarly with the pedestrian metrics, like we're looking at percentage of streets with sidewalks on both sides and linear feet of sidewalks built or repaired. But the way that sidewalks pop up here locally is that it's the developer, whoever's building, that is in charge of putting in a sidewalk. So we'll have a house with a sidewalk in front of it, the sidewalk ends and then begins a house later or goes into a fence. So if we have that, it still, again, doesn't go to the connectivity issue. And so I would really recommend, you know, we've seen some metrics based out of like San Diego that really show that population density can be one measure, especially in somewhere like Bend, where it's really hard to pinpoint where historically marginalized communities live other than anecdotally, that they really showed, I can't remember what exactly the numbers were, but how much more effective bike lanes are when they're constructed in very high density areas versus less dense areas. I also would encourage things like considering walk sheds or bike sheds that include, you know, how many residents can access essential services. And this is where we can really link those equity performance measures, you know, to essential services. Can each household reach you on an LTS 1 network maybe, right? So we're saying, like, can we get to a grocery store, to medical services, to a school without having to have disconnected bicycle or pedestrian infrastructure? So those were just some of my initial observations around those performance measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. It's great. And Rob.
Yeah, I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Eugene. And I especially appreciate all the work done on trying to integrating equity into this process for the performance measures. And I look forward to, doing that work. My comments are more about the actual performance measures that are shown here that TPR recommended for 2018. I feel like between that and the STS regional trajectory, was that what they were called? And the inputs that we did when we did the scenario planning work in the Eugene Springfield area, and the inputs that we've used for the strategic assessment. And the inputs are things that you can actually they go into the model and you can kind of turn them up or down, and it has an impact on what kind of greenhouse gas emissions you get. So it might be like hours of transit service, or the actual bike, biking mode is actually an input for that model. So they're kind of all melding together for me, and I'm not quite sure. I guess this is looking back to what we did in 2018, but I'm kind of interested to see where we're heading with all these different elements. And I feel like I don't know. I want to talk about it more. I know now's not the right time, but if there was an opportunity to have some side groups for people that wanted to dig in to these more, I think that would be helpful. One particular comment I have is the percent of households in mixed use or transit-oriented development areas. I think that's using the place types tool that Cody and DLCD developed. And I found that it wasn't necessarily a good fit for Eugene. So for example, there's high density housing next to or very close to the University of Oregon. Most of the people who live there are walking or biking to campus, but because it's not actually a mixed use area in and of itself, because it's mostly just residential, it wasn't actually considered to be a mixed use or transit oriented area. So if there was some way to customize the land use tool for the unique attributes of our communities, and how likely people are to walk or bike or take the bus in different kinds of developments, I think that would be really helpful. I think that is all that I have to say. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Let's go to Emma and then Michael.
Thank you. Working on unmuting here. Emma Newman with City of Springfield again. I think Cody mentioned there might be an opportunity to have further explanation on this, but the guiding piece and question on my mind is, are these measures actually tied to getting to the greenhouse gas emission results that we want? And if so, what evidence or what can we point to that shows that these are actually the right things to measure to make that happen? I think that there's a number of things on here that are things that could potentially be measured, but aren't necessarily in alignment with what we found from the regional scenario planning process in Eugene Springfield. I guess that's the second piece of my question is, will these performance measures be modified based on scenario planning, which is one of the follow-on steps of all of this? How will they be used? Or is it kind of trying to come up with performance measures that are a blanket statewide application? We might spend a lot of time and resources measuring something that doesn't necessarily get us to the greenhouse gas emission results that we actually want to see. So I'd love to hear, where did these measures come from and how are they tied to the greenhouse gas reduction?
So I'll say that the the categories themselves are tied to the work in the scenario planning and the strategic assessment work that we've been doing over 10 years. They're actions found in the STS. We don't have a one-to-one relationship of, I'm just going to keep using the same example just for clarity's sake, is bike lanes or high quality bike lanes to the bike mode shift that we have in the statewide transportation strategy. So coming up with that crosswalk is some work that we'll have to be doing to implement this concept. But we do know that these, I would think, and we can all agree that these aren't the right categories. We are certainly interested in hearing if you don't think these are the right categories to reduce climate pollution. But this is kind of based on a decade or more of work to do this. And so it is something that how high for each of these categories would be different for each area or each city. And that's the work that we'd have to be doing to connect those regional benchmarks from the statewide transportation strategy of the levels of ambition to setting benchmarks for these or similar performance measures that we adopt.
Thank you. I guess the follow-on for that is based on listening into the commission's conversation, I think it was on Friday at their meeting, I think the institutional influence comments are really applicable to performance measures. I'd really like to see the performance measures vetted with a lens of what do local jurisdictions actually have control over. For instance, the percentage of households in mixed-use transit-oriented development areas, the employment. The city isn't actually in the business of building housing. Yes, we can affect the zoning and the regulations that allow for it. So maybe changing some of those measures to encourage local jurisdictions to make progress on allowing the types of housing and development that would achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. But, you know, having something that's outside of the local jurisdiction's control, the local city council could do all actions that they could possibly do and still not affect the outcome. And so it'd be nice to have them aligned with what's actually within the authority of local decision making. Thank you.
That's a great comment. Thank you. And a good clarification. When we're projecting things out into the future, we're absolutely relying on plans. So it might say people living in these areas, but for all intents and purposes, we're measuring the plans of local areas. Are these zonings, you know, resulting in the allowance for that to happen? But something more concrete might be like transit. Like we know with certainty, you know, what we're planning for transit.
Thanks, Cody. And also just in the slide that's up here, I don't know if this was said before, but TDM on the category column means transportation demand management. And Cody, do you want to just in 20 seconds tell us what that means for those that don't know?
Sure. I might throw a lifeline over here to Paige. You can probably describe it better than I can.
So I often compare this to preventative health personnel. You know, you go to see your doctor to get prescribed or, you know, some type of diagnosis, but preventive health is really trying to offset you even having to go to the doctor. This is very much what TDM professionals do. They're mostly customer service oriented. They work with individuals who are interested in changing their travel behavior, maybe reducing their drive alone trips by even just 1 or 2 a week, or even going cold turkey and just completely getting rid of their car. But on a very basic level, it's a hand-holding process. There's a lot of training and trip planning and assistance that happens throughout that behavior change model. And, you know, we work on an incentive-based, you know, model, but also the disincentive by having to pay for parking or having a hard time finding parking or having to, you know, pay for things that are often very costly for driving helps with also encouraging people to reduce their drive alone trips.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Paige.
Okay, and looking at the queue here, there are a lot of hands up. So just to do some balance of speaking time and hear from folks that we haven't heard yet today, I'm going to call on Jayraj Singh first, and then Oriana Magnera, who couldn't get her hand up. So Jayraj, over to you.
Hey everyone, my name is Jayraj Singh. I use they, he pronouns. I'm the Clackamas County Chapter Director with Unite Oregon. So I'm answering the question, what are the actions that cities and counties should take at the local level? I think measuring pedestrian connectivity between neighborhood pods, especially in the suburbs and rural areas where BIPOC communities are continuing to get pushed out and or choosing to reside. I think a lot of the communities we are working with at Unite are captive drivers now and are not comfortable or feel safe using other modes. So whatever we can do to increase walkability for shorter trips and activities, I think will be helpful. There's a real power dynamic I'm noticing and a resistance from more established, well-resourced neighborhood groups and HOAs from increasing connectivity to increasing walkability and focusing on connectivity away from main thoroughfares. So I think there needs to be a way to bypass sort of these powerful, more exclusionary sort of NIMBY forces at the local jurisdictions.
Thank you, Jayraj. And Oriana.
Thanks. I just want to show appreciation for the work that's gone into this, but I think I'll start with a clarifying question and then kind of follow up explaining where the question is coming from. And that clarifying question is, was community consulted in coming up with these performance measures, or are they just kind of traditional measures that have been used in the state or federally or just typically in planning? Like what's been community involvement in shaping what is being measured and valued in this space?
So these measures were developed with a bunch of state, local, regional staff. It was not something that we did with community involvement. This was something that we did through a subcommittee of work. And that is why I think we're opening it up here. We wanted to have these as a starting place for discussion, but not, the ending place for the discussion.
Yeah, just keeping in balance, how limited resources are and time is for community, and still acknowledging that this body has a lot of value, but still we all have privilege and power and have levels of education and access to transit. And, I can't speak for everyone here, but just imagining the kinds of folks who are typically selected for a rack space and have the privilege to apply for a rack space, we may be missing out, even within this really talented and excellent group, on some perspectives. And namely, I think these performance measures very much read like they were come up with by folks who are used to planning and are on staff for cities and thinking about things in very kind of linear and grid, and less about the actual experience of using the different kinds of uses of planning spaces, or these different categories. And I think one issue that is in particular missing that I notice is just safety associated with using a bike lane or pedestrian access, or a street that's been reconfigured to prioritize non-auto modes. It's not valuable if all this planning work is done and then it's just used to be completely blunt, just from a Portland kind of centric perspective by white folks, or if it leads to gentrification. Like there's no performance metrics here associated with preventing displacement. And that's something at least my organization has done a lot of work on around like rain garden infrastructure, which is really important for stormwater management, but it can cause displacement by increasing home values. So how do we make sure that none of these different categories also cause harm to communities, in particular from a displacement perspective, but also where can we find opportunities to gain feedback about what the experience is of any of these arenas, or what kinds of performance measures community really wants to see and how they're viewing the system. Like that human element feels a little bit missing here. And that's, I think, maybe necessarily so in some respects, but I guess my question and challenge to the space is how do we build in more of a human element? How do we build more responsiveness to community in a meaningful way about what it's like to be in a city, what it's like to have a climate adapted city and have it be meaningful and valuable and increase quality of life rather than doing harm.
Sylvia?
Mm-hmm.
Oriana, I know I'm jumping the line. This is Kirsten, so I'll be short, but Steve Lee with the governor's office also had kind of a similar point. Steve, do you want to speak at all to this? Oriana kind of opened it up, but I know you were having the same thought from an email you sent me there.
Quickly.
Oh, Steve, you're back on mute. Sorry, sir. There you are.
System-centered, not community-centered. And so I just said, can you build on those to make them more community-centered? And then looking at the list of outcomes, I don't see how any of those measures get you to the 8 outcomes that were around the equity outcomes. So, a stronger connection between whatever's on this list with some of the list of outcomes would be really helpful.
Thank you. And then I would just also chime in, like, how do we allow local governments who know their communities the best to actually hear from community too in the process? And those are some of those process related goals. So thank you. Back to you, Sylvia, and the queue. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Brianna.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll go to Nancy Evanson and then Ken Anderton.
I've got a very focused question, I think. I'm trying to understand
how we understand some of this stuff. On the bike level of traffic stress, do we have any ability to say if to take the speed limit on a street and say if the speed limit is above, say, 35 miles an hour, then you have to have a separate bike lane on the street? Do we have that kind of ability to at least recommend that kind of a thing be recommended? Sorry, I'm losing my my words here.
No, I think I take your meaning. So yeah, cities, I believe, and some of the city folk here could probably school me on this, but I believe that the answer is yes. Cities plan for transportation system plans. We'll be talking about that much more as we go down the line here. But yes, they can develop context-sensitive solutions. So they can say if the speed or the amount of cars that a street has would need to have maybe a separate facility or a buffered bike lane to make it a more less stress road for you to ride on.
Make that kind of a recommendation.
Yeah, and it really is kind of coordinating your bike network that you're planning for with maybe the road network that you're planning for. Yeah. And so maybe it's looking at the road parallel to that really kind of high auto speed and volume road and identifying a low volume route that's kind of going in the same direction that you could put your bike lane on. So there are different ways to get about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ken.
Right, I'm Ken Anderton. I'm representing the single parent group. As I read through this, I had the same kind of summary as both Oriana and Steve in terms of this is very planning speak, and I realize you have to break it down because we're talking about planning rules and that. But I try to look at it from the average person, especially the average single parent, and how they actually go about living their lives. And looking at the graph on page 26 of our packet, where it does a good job of showing, housing, jobs. Those are places we go to. And then it lists the way we get there, streets, walk, bike, transit options. But one thing it really ignores is schools. That's another major destination. And as a single parent, often they have no partner and no way to get their kids to school if there's not good bus options. Many have been pushed out to outer margins of urban areas, or some are even in rural areas. Buses are notoriously diesel that school districts use, and they operate in fleets. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think you have to look from everyday perspective of how a person goes about their day, where they stop and where they go. One is jobs, one's school, one is housing. And if you're far away from schools because your housing's way out there and you got to figure out how to get your kids, to school so you can go to a job. And we've seen during this pandemic how important schools are. They help feed our kids, especially low income children. They help some ways house, in emergencies. And they're important for people to be able to go to work because they're also part of our healthcare or our childcare network. And so I would encourage that to be called out. If I'm to read this TPR graph, it gives me a headache, from a non-planner standpoint, trying to figure out what you're meaning. I would suggest you do a little bit more common language in some of this and maybe examples of, citing some case studies in that of how this works might be helpful. But in general, I think looping in the school aspect is important for us to consider in equity outcomes because they mean so much to our community, and there's so many things school districts do that also contribute to climate change and and impacts to our kids. So that would be my comments.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. And Michael, and then Mary Kyle.
I was just turning on my microphone. I think, first of all, I wanted to say that I fully echo and support what Leanne said about the importance of connectivity and density. And those should be the areas where we are focusing, because, you know, even in the Portland area, you ride a bike around and suddenly the bike lane ends and you're at a really big intersection and there's nowhere to go. And so connectivity is a huge problem. I also wanted to say that as we're looking at the pedestrian row, it's really important for the sidewalks to be fully accessible. Too often, certainly in the Portland area, you'll get to a curb and there won't be a curb cut. And so if you are a person with a mobility disability, you may not be able to have seamless connectivity. So that's an important consideration, I think. Also, with regards to transit, the transit row, there are two issues here. One is the transportation infrastructure and making sure that that is accessible, as well as the means of transit. So making sure that all buses or light rail or whatever mode of transit is used is fully accessible. So thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And Mary Kyle.
Thank you. Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon, she, her pronouns. I think basically what we're trying to get at in the performance measures categories are, will they reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And we're never going to know perfectly, but pretty good sense. Will the measure categories that we're choosing reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And whether they do or not really depends on whether they resonate with the way people live. And therefore, sort of echoing what Emily and others have said is, linear miles of bike projects or sidewalks isn't going to get us there. It has to take into account the quality and experience of those, safety, et cetera. And so I just think these all need to be reworded. The greenhouse gas performance measures should line up with our equity outcomes, because those are whether or not they are true to how people live their lives and would like to live their lives. And then the thing that I find missing here, among other things on the land use side, is taking into account the percentage of housing within a mixed use area or close to transit that's affordable, and then also including anti-displacement measures. But I understand that local governments are not generally the builders or providers of affordable housing, but we've just gone through a lot. LCDC has just gone through a lot in adoption of rules related to housing, including housing affordability and density in its House Bills 2001 and 2003 rulemaking. And there's a lot that we can borrow from that to make housing relatively more affordable in these areas that we are targeting here, and including anti-displacement measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. Let's go to Ariel Nelson and then Paige.
Thanks, Sylvia. I had raised my hand when Emma was sharing about cities not building housing and those measures. And basically it was going to make a similar point to what Mary Kyle just made, which is that, cities and DLCD and stakeholders recently did a lot of work, and there's a lot that we can borrow from, and want to make sure that we're aligning with particularly the housing production strategies requirements that are coming up. And, if we're looking at near term, more immediate progress to be made, cities will be implementing those housing production strategies pretty soon. And so there's a real opportunity there for DLCD to be lending technical assistance to even further align the potential strategies that cities will consider, as well as equitable outcomes, outreach to underserved communities. Public process is a requirement and part of those rules. So just want to make sure that we're not forgetting that. Very much in line with what Mary Kyle was just saying. And those rules, particularly around 2003, there was a lot of conversation at the RAC for those, recognizing that this work was going to be coming and that there were overlapping goals with climate justice and housing and displacement issues that we could be accomplishing.
Yeah. Sylvia, just a note, we can send out those rules with the next packet. There's a lot of precedent work there. It's Ariel's right. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that connection. Paige.
Yeah, this is definitely a wonky topic here. So I guess I want to first defend the very simplistic list from a measurability standpoint. It's definitely not a sexy list, but when we on the original RAC, when we were trying to figure out how to make a universally applicable set of measures, this was what we came up with, and it was years worth or so of looking at other performance measures. But yes, everything can always be improved, and I even have some recommendations coming out of this process. So this has been really enlightening. But one of the main things that that I think is missing out of the transit or transportation system plans is that we don't overlay them over any demographic data. The projects that are in the plans are just a very agnostic look of bike ped projects, road projects, modernization projects, et cetera. And modernization projects are basically new roads. For those who don't know, retrofitting would be an existing road. But I think that's a very easy way for us to get to something that's on the ground, is to require TSPs to have that analysis done when they're coming up with this list. And then for these performance measures, it definitely is missing an equity element. And how do we get to that? And so percentage of projects that are within historically marginalized communities, perhaps, or one that we've talked about before and that was in the original equity statement was percentage of investment of our funding that is within historically marginalized communities. And I think that in particular is an interesting one, because when you look at development-driven sidewalks, for example, land use application requires that they put in a sidewalk in the front of their development. That would be considered private funding. And so a city's investment, or your MPO's STBG or CMAQ funds, the federal funds, could be measured as part of this. I wanted to echo something that Emma said, though, when in regards to the mixed use transit oriented development. That's an extremely difficult thing to define. And all of us probably have a different vision of what that looks like in our own heads. And it's going to be just as difficult for us to come up with a good definition. And so Emma had a recommendation to land on zoning instead of a land use type. And I think that would get to Rob's comment too about student housing, which is largely residential, but I'm assuming high density residential. And so I wonder if there's a way that we can kind of swap this out for different zoning, and that would allow us to account for not only a universal measure that we have across all of our cities, but also makes it so that we don't have to try to come up with some illustrative definition that might not be applicable to certain areas. And then lastly, I am very concerned about gentrification with this process. And it's been echoed by others that when we make small investments in very low income neighborhoods with public funds, it often ends up causing gentrification. I don't know the answer to that, but I think we just need to keep reminding ourselves that that is a reality and that we need to try and avoid it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. Appreciate that. And there are about 3 more hands up here, and we definitely want to get to all these comments. We do have one more topic for today, which is review of proposed amendments for required regional scenario planning. So I think we'll take these 3 comments and then move into that next topic. So Julie, go ahead.
Hi, so Julie Warnicki with the City of Salem. I feel like we could talk about these proposed performance measures, for a very long time. We could refine them, make them better. And I still feel like I'm not understanding the difference between these and what would come out of the scenario planning or the interim, whatever it is that we're going to do. So I'm feeling like a lot of sort of duplication of effort potentially, and maybe that's just me. And then I guess the other thing that I wanted to bring up, and this maybe doesn't directly tie to gentrification, but these facilities that we're talking about are very expensive. So sidewalks where they don't exist, adding them is very expensive. Bringing all of the sidewalks up to meet required standards is very important and it's very expensive. And somebody has to pay that cost. And how that cost gets allocated in the community, in the newer areas of town, it's private. Like somebody was just saying, it's a development requirement. In older areas of town, at least in our jurisdiction, that largely comes down to geo bond measures that then are paid by property taxes and passed on to renters. And so they're very limited sources of funding. And I appreciate that part of this effort is to draw attention to that gap. And that is important, but we do have to recognize that even if we do fill that gap, somebody is paying it. And so I would hope that we could have measures that would help us to prioritize where limited funds should be, best spent. And then also something that we can measure, which is can be really very difficult. So that's all.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Sarah and then Emma.
I would echo a lot of comments, but I'm not going to do that. I'll just put it in the written. But I did want to, within the quarter mile of the priority transit corridor, I do think we do need to be very careful there. Often that'll be a higher pollution, air pollution area, and there's a historic tendency to cite higher density housing in undesirable higher pollution areas. And so to the extent that we might be incentivizing the continuation of that pattern, it's concerning. And I also wanted to just comment on inclusive process that was raised earlier. And, I think that this RAC, looks, more inclusive than many other government, stakeholder groups than I've been on or seen. And so I think that that's a great step. But I also think it, and I know others do too here, that, listening to the affected communities or potentially affected communities has to include more, of course, than the RAC. And, and I think as quickly as possible in the process, of course, would kind of create the most robust inclusiveness. And so I was wondering do we need a subcommittee, or is there work ongoing to get that process of listening? And, I've been brainstorming in other groups that I'm involved with, how to do that listening without putting more work on BIPOC communities and groups. How to show up for them instead of asking them to show up for us, speaking as a white woman. So I was wondering if that kind of thinking and is going on right now about how to get that public process happening ASAP. And if is it maybe there's a need for some subcommittee or something to work on that.
Sylvia.
Go ahead, Kirsten.
It's Kirsten here, and Deputy Director. I'm just sort of stepping in here for a moment to hold some space for Kevin and Bill, the co-project managers. This is obviously a massive effort, and I'm thinking, Sarah, that probably the best place to try and engage, granted we're in a global pandemic. I was even thinking of earlier of, I don't know if for those that know James Rojas, place it workshop, kind of found object, tactile, tabletop exercises are so fabulous for talking about memory and getting into communities from a community person's perspective on, just as Ken and others were saying, what matters to them as they move about their day. It'd be awesome to be able to do that, and we're still under stay-at-home orders. So gathering is not normal these days, and we are very grateful for the RAC members, both who are representing community-based organizations at the table and not. So I just want to recognize it is hard to engage, period, right now. So I want to thank you for both of your and Oriana's kind of call to ask, like, where and when do we do better engagement, or where and when do we ask local governments to do better engagement? So right now we're at the statewide rules process, as part of the statewide rules process, we are planning community conversations coming up in April and May. Again, those will unfortunately be web-based, but perhaps we could at least invite some testimonial. Again, it's coming to this table, so I look for other ideas, but at least testimonial from some community-based organizations in the regions as part of those community conversations, so we can just get a different flavor from what it's like to live in an area and have a lived experience of being Black, Indigenous, people of color. And it's a lot of times folks want the same things, but it's also, from what I understand, much more difficult if you're not white. So being a white person, we're interested in hearing what these rules can help produce that would make outcomes better. I think this RAC will be pleased about what's going to come out. We are talking about a number of disparate sort of in related tracks here. But at the end of the day, it is about investments in historically underinvested areas that often coincide with historically marginalized folks. So all the mapping and work you're talking about will be important, particularly at the local level. But as far as these rules go, would like to work with our team on kind of hearing some of those perspectives as part of the community conversations this summer. And probably that's about the extent of what we can promise, being our agency is down 34% due to COVID-related budget cuts. So unfortunately, we don't have the excess resources to continue to contract with community-based organizations until our fund is replenished, hopefully on July 1. So Sarah, thanks for the question. Sorry for the long-winded answer. I don't know, Kevin, if you have any other process, Kevin or Bill, the co-PMs, if you'd like to.
Yeah. No, Kirsten, I'm thinking along the same terms. I think those community conversations will be an important medium for reaching out to those communities and identifying, every community is different. So want to build engagement at that level. But I also want to note that, as we're talking about rules mostly today, there's also the technical assistance piece that happens as we do scenario planning, as we support local government compliance. And through that technical assistance piece, I think that we will have the ability to build in inclusivity in those processes. DLCD and ODOT staff will be at the table as we're kind of getting those projects off the ground, getting those projects started. So that's another area where we can look at that. But your point is well taken, that we need to begin early in the process to engage, the groups that are going to be hopefully most positively impacted by the changes we're making. And certainly we don't want them to be negatively impacted by those changes. So those are my thoughts.
Can I know we're short on time, but if I could just respond briefly. The reason why I raised the potential for some kind of subcommittee or just a small work group is that, I think a lot of us have different experiences and represent different populations. And there are creative ways I can think of, but I won't take time up right now, to start inclusion earlier in a way that isn't as straining on resources, staff and money resources. And historically, there's been so much harm to BIPOC communities that comes from land use law and regulation. and also been, policies packaged as benign that have really been either intentionally or unintentionally incredibly harmful. And so my push for this is that that early inclusion is, I think, really important for trust building and legitimacy. And even though we're doing state level rules right now, if we're looking at this set of rules that we're looking at and talking about right now for the last hour, and we're commenting as a group about where they're lacking in terms of equity, it strikes me that now's the time to be talking to people so that we don't inadvertently, just do this exercise in a vacuum, not a true vacuum, because we have this great rack. But anyway, so I'd certainly be willing to volunteer or to talk with anyone who wants to.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just would say that because we are, everyone's struggling right now. It's pandemic. We're struggling with the results of wildfires and people continuing to still be displaced without homes through the wildfires. So it is a everyone stretched period, and worse if you're non-white, I presume. So the part of the reason that there are some some community-based organizations who are on contract to help represent different perspectives at this RAC was that intent, Sarah. So a lot of what we are planning to do is at this table, but in addition, I think and that was intentional by design and by investment, with ODOT's participation as well. So definitely want to, take you up on that and, ask other members if, as you're completing your survey, if you'd like to let Ingrid know if you're interested in that kind of a conversation, let us know. I think that my staff would probably just block all my calls if I, on the fly, initiate another subcommittee, but I see Kevin nodding his head that he'd be willing to work with some folks. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kirsten, Sarah, Kevin. All right, Emma, I think you're the last person to comment on this one, then we got to get to our next topic. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep it brief. I echo a lot of the comments and I appreciate the conversation so far. Just 3 brief thoughts. The first one is in the Eugene Springfield area, we have done a travel barriers and benefits survey now for 2 cycles. And I think that might be a tool that could help focus in on what are people's actual lived experiences with barriers to walking, biking, transit, et cetera. Because if we're not clear on the problem that we're trying to solve for, then I don't think the measures are going to end up being the right measure. I also hope that whatever performance measures we settle on are not focused on the American Community Survey, focused on the commute trip, because commute trips are only one piece of the transportation system. It doesn't represent all trip types and all different users of our public spaces. So part 2, I would love to see some progress made on the topic of sidewalks. This was brought up by Leanne. I echo Michael's comments, particularly regarding quality of sidewalk facility and accessibility. The development standards that are on the books, and I imagine many cities across Oregon and the metro areas that we're discussing, have changed over time and have resulted in great disparities. So we have neighborhoods that have complete sidewalk networks. We have neighborhoods that were developed when there were economic downturns and the cities were just trying to get housing built, let alone all the amenities to support that housing. So right now in the city of Springfield code, it is the private property owner's responsibility to maintain the sidewalk. I think there's some creative ways to look at funding of sidewalks that other jurisdictions have developed, but that's a topic that I would love to come to some solution so that it's not this continued disparity of, well, if your house was developed or your property was developed in a time period when times were tough, then it wasn't built initially, and now it's up to lower income and lower wealth residents on streets with local improvement districts to bring up extra money, or that's not politically palatable at the city council level. So then it takes additional public funds that are very sparse. There just needs to be a better solution. If we're going to have public streets be funded by public transportation dollars consistently, we need to figure out a solution to build out the sidewalk network in a comprehensive way. And then lastly, I'm looking to figure out, like, how can we actually build in resilience to what Kirsten was just saying? Like, we're experiencing a lot right now. One piece of that is the economic downturn. So looking at the performance measure of transportation options staff per capita, with the economic hits of COVID early on last year, almost all of our transportation options staff in our whole region in Eugene Springfield area were either decreased hours or completely let go. The transit service was severely cut. So how do we structure things in such a way that, you know, we can have performance measures that maybe in good economic years we're checking the list and saying, yep, we're doing well, we're making progress. But I'd like to put some systems in place so that there's more resiliency built in. And when times get tough, the people who are hardest hit don't experience as much of a burden.
Okay, thank you, Emma. And thanks to everyone for your great ideas and perspectives. Yes.
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much. Your input is just critical to figuring all this out. This is not the end of this discussion. I think we'll be talking about this for a little bit now. And also just the survey and the key questions worksheets. I think we're just like blown away by the depth and breadth of input or feedback that we're getting from you all. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. Okay, and with that, we are going to move into our last topic, and Matt Krall is going to, we'll have to kind of shorten a little bit, I think, this review of the amendments to Division 44, but I will just hand it over to you to frame this conversation, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion. May need to get more of your input from the survey on this one than we would have liked to.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. Hi, I am Matt Krall, the Planning Services Division Manager here at Department of Land Conservation and Development. And my involvement has been a lot with the rules, the actual text here that you're looking at. And I think, Bill, if you want to bring up that slide for a moment. And before we jump into this draft rule, Casaria Taylor, who is our rules expert, our rules coordinator, is going to talk just a little bit about some of the terminology in rules and the process.
Well, I'm sure going to try to give it like the 45-second overview. Just so you all are aware, this is a 2-day fully comprehensive Department of Justice training to just go over constructing a rule. So I'm going to give it to you in just about a minute. What you all are going to be looking at is OAR 660, which is the chapter set aside for DLCD, Division 44, which is Matt, what are the exact words for title for Division 44?
Metropolitan Planning Rule.
So that's a specific title, a specific section of the rule, and I want to get it right, so I won't try to guess. And then the last 4 digits of an OAR are the individual rule number. So you all are going to be working on writing or amending individual rules within Division 44. And basically think of rule as a statement of policy, starting from the most basic form. Could be a single sentence. If it goes over that and becomes multiple paragraphs, then we start adding the numbering. So we'll start with a 1. You cannot have a 1 without a 2. So it must continue on. So there you have your subsections. It could dive deeper in the Roman numerals and continue on. We try not to, though, because then that's not something that the average person, or even the very educated person, is able to understand. There's more of a formal English that is used when writing rules. These are legal aspects of what we do, so it is a little bit more formal. But that's about all I can give you in 45 seconds without giving you the full DOJ rundown.
Thanks. I think that covered it. I guess we could have a quick, if there's some clarifying questions for Casaria right now.
Yeah, if there's ever any questions, let me know. I have all of the DOJ law manuals sitting here at home with me. I won't make you read the 600 pages each, but I can give you a rundown and quickly answer questions along the way.
And we will at several points have our lawyer at Department of Justice look over these to help us to do that too. So there'll be multiple eyes on these rules. Well, so the big point I want to make right now is what we're looking at here is a draft. This is the first draft you've seen. There's going to be multiple rounds of revision. If we're short on time today, if there are things in there that you think, that's not quite right, don't panic yet. Get us the information. We will have multiple opportunities to work on that. The second thing I want to say is that rule writing is hard because you are trying to be that formal and we're trying to be very specific. Over the years when I've done this, no matter how much I think that like our internal team, we've worked on it, we've talked about it, we've looked at things, we still, when we get out to the bigger group, we find out that we missed things. We find there's ambiguities in there. Sometimes it goes years later, the courts will come back and tell us that there's an ambiguity we didn't realize in there. So please don't be shy about speaking up and saying, that part doesn't make sense, or you got something wrong here, you got some numbering wrong. We need that feedback. We need it from people who are fresh perspective, who weren't the ones writing it. So it's really important. If you do have that feedback, probably most of it right now is going to need to come either in the survey or send an email to that project email address. And especially if it's some of the more minor stuff that, if we weren't consistent in a term or had some numbering or cross references wrong, just send those in. Probably not discussion today. I hope we have some time to have some of the discussion today on a broader policy and maybe clarifying questions. And the big question, to bring it back to our worksheet, and our big question for today is, do you think the proposed rules are generally on the right track or the wrong track? What are any concerns? And what do you think could be improved? So that's taken from a worksheet. That's what I want you to think about while we're talking about these. And what this rule is doing, what the big, if you're to summarize it up, one big thing, it's taking the scenario planning process. Previously, it's been mandatory that Metro do that for the Portland area. And now we're going to be making it through this rulemaking process for all of the cities and counties in all of the metropolitan areas. So that's the biggest thing that we're doing here. I'll walk through a couple of these just to help you see where that happens in this rule. I'm not going to try to get into each line. If you think of this as a street map, we're talking about maybe the block level. I'm not going to get into each building, but if we have discussions, certainly do ask about specific pieces of it. And so the question came up, what is the title? So Division 44, there's a title on there right about in the middle of your screen, Metropolitan Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets. Well, within this division, each of these different rules, so the first rule is 0000, and it is the purpose. And I'm going to disagree with Kasari on one point right here. This one doesn't have to be in completely formal language because it is a purpose, and we can be a little more broad and general to help people understand what we're trying to accomplish. And it gets used later if there needs to be interpretation of some of that more specific language. This is all new. What you see here, it replaces a much longer purpose in the existing rules. So take a look at that, see what you think about that. The next section that we'll skim through quickly are some definitions. Now you'll notice in here, this is existing text. So there's just this highlight and underline that shows, or the red text where we make changes. A couple of changes we want to add is the community-based conversations, the equitable outcomes, and then a little down further, the biggest one that's I think one of the most important is the definition for historically marginalized communities taken from that outcomes document. This is going to be a really important definition. So keep your eyes open for that phrase as we read the rest of the rules, and always remember, here's the definition for it. But the next section I want to look at is section 15, or not section, whoop, got my terminology wrong. Rule, we're looking at rule 15 here, 0015. And this is really where it happens. This is where that requirement gets placed on cities and counties, and it happens through setting deadlines. When do you have to do this? Because that's what makes it, an official, it's a requirement now. The first part just restates the current that it already applies to Metro. Number 2 there sets out some specific dates by which it's going to apply to specific cities. That's what we're doing right now for Salem, Kaiser area, the Eugene, Springfield area. And then sections 3 and 4 are setting up a process in the future where the Land Conservation Development Commission will apply this to additional areas. So we're not setting the whole, in this draft does not set all of the schedule for all of the other areas, but it creates a process for doing that. So from here, I want to skip over. There's a bunch of existing rules, and you'll see there's proposed changes in there. A lot of that does apply to Metro. So I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to jump all the way down to Rule 100, which is the next part that I think we really need to look at. And that is It is an entirely new rule. So that's why we did not use the underline and the red text for all of that, because just all of 100 is new. And it defines the idea of what is a work program to do scenario planning, because that got mentioned up in Rule 15 as far as there being deadlines and requirements to prepare a work program. Well, here's a description of what has to be in the work program. I would focus, let's see, number 3, section 3 within there, the public engagement plan is an important part, that it has to have that, how are you going to outreach and include historically marginalized communities and use those community-based conversations that are defined up above. Then there is Rule 110, which Rule 110 is describing the content of, okay, so you've gone through that process, you've done what's in the work program, what do you end up with? What is this package, this document, this plan, this preferred scenario that comes out of it? And so there's a whole, I think there's about a dozen sections in there that describe the different elements that have to be in that package. And some of them are some of the basic things you might think of, that it's, you know, a list of where you're going to build transportation, where do we expect people to be living, what kind of densities and jobs are in the future. If you scroll down a little bit though, there's some of the ones that I think that we're adding now as we're looking more of an equity aspect on it. There's 8 is the performance measures about reducing the greenhouse gases that we've been talking about. But 9 is some performance measures for the equitable outcomes. 10 is you need to include information as best you can about the demographics of these various historically marginalized communities. Not all of that is mappable, not all of that data is available, but whatever is needs to be included in this package. Reporting on those community-based conversations, the work program required them. At your final package, you need to report on what has been done with those. And number 12, I think is going to be a tough one, but it's a really important, kind of that final linchpin that holds the whole thing together, is an assessment of how the benefits and burdens of all of this, everything else you've planned in this plan, how does it benefit and burden onto the historic marginalized community members, looking at compared to the population. So we'll go through the next couple are kind of a procedural. Those two are describing the work program, describing the package that results at the end of it. Rule 120 shows how that comes. It's been prepared by the cities and counties. They all work together. They produce this package. They bring it in, gets reviewed by the department and the commission, and they give it at some point, hopefully a thumbs up, right? It's good work. It gets approved. And then again, the next one, 130, I think I'll again call this a linchpin. It's at the end here, but it's really important. It's not enough just to prepare this as a document and bring it up and get it approved. The local governments then take those actions to implement it, adopt changes to zoning, change the planning, the transportation system plan, so that you're building different projects. Maybe some projects come off your transportation system plan and some go on as a result of this work. There's a change in those local government actions. I'll briefly note there's 2 placeholders there, 140 and 150. We're not working on those yet. We wanted to focus on this other part now, but those will be coming, and they are very important also to have that reporting process, periodically reporting on the progress at implementing. And I wish we could leave off the enforcement section, but anytime you are talking about laws and rules, you do have to address the question of how is this going to be enforced, and what happens if a deadline is missed. So we'll be addressing that in some of our future meetings. Let me just double check my notes if there was anything else that I wanted to be sure to cover. I think that's it as far as an outline. So for whatever time we have left, we can discuss parts of this, or please send in your input in writing to help us out on this. We need a fresh perspective on it. We've been staring at it for too long to be able to see a lot of it now.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. That's a really good kind of overview of this document, because I think it is maybe a little bit challenging to read otherwise without this piece to kind of explain what's in the document. So survey comments after today are very, very welcome, but we do have a little bit of time for questions or comments. So feel free to raise your hand. Paige, I see your hand's up if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I have to admit, I did not read through this entire language. It's a lot of work that the staff put in. But my question has to do with the approval authority of the of the plan, let's say? Does it go to a planning commission, transportation commission, and then it goes to city council? And then does it have to go through the MPO? Does it have to go through LCDC? Like, is that in here yet? And could you point that out?
Yeah, I think the general outline of that is in here. So, but the answer is going to be partly, it depends. In the work program, it will be up to the cities and counties to define what is going to be the process of working together, because there is, in the Rogue Valley, there is no metro, there is no regional elected government. So the cities and counties will need to come together and decide, how are we going to work together? What is the approval process? How are decisions made? And it's not for the state to really dictate that. We would want to see each region come up with a plan that works. So that's what happens during the working. At some point, a package is put together and we say, this is it. This is the preferred scenario. We, the cities and counties, elected leaders have decided. That is then sent to the state and it comes to the department first. I'm hopeful that in most cases, it'll be a really great package and we will have been working all along. It won't be a surprise and we would give it a thumbs up and it could be approved at the department level. And that's what the rules allow. If there are some questions, and when I say to department level, of course, that's that authority is vested in the director of DLCD. If there are some questions, perhaps there's some local dispute going on. Maybe we're hearing from involved parties or advocacy groups that it falls short in some way, or if the staff thinks it falls short, there is no authority for the staff to reject it. What it does is it kicks over to a commission hearing at the Land Conservation Development Commission. And they would be the ones then to hear both sides, have a hearing and say either, yeah, it's approved, or it's a remand. Please go back and work on these elements. Does that cover the kinds of questions you were thinking of, Paige?
Right, it does. Thank you. And then for maybe the next sections that you're drafting with the progress reporting, and if they're falling short of the benchmarks over time, who changed it? Does it have to go through that whole process again? Maybe you haven't written that out yet.
So I would appreciate any suggestions you have.
I don't have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and Rob.
Hi, yeah. So I have a couple of questions or comments. One is, so for the Central Lane MPO, and that includes Eugene and Springfield, it's saying that we would have to submit a preferred land use and transportation scenario to the commission by June 30th of 2022. Yet this rulemaking process isn't scheduled to be adopted by LCDC until winter of 21-22. And I don't understand how we could possibly get that all done after the adoption. We might only have 4 or 5 months before June 30th of 2022. It kind of feels like it would be helpful if the DLCD staff could figure out how long should a process like this take, and then look at, once adoption happens by LCDC, then forecast that amount of time forward, and then come up with a new deadline rather than presupposing that and putting a number in here. I mean, one thing is that there's a lot more land use in here than in the scenario planning we did before, and then in the strategic assessment. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I do think it'll make it a lot more labor intensive. It'll be a lot more work, a lot more community engagement probably. And that also takes more time. And so I think we should have some conversations about what that would all involve in a particular or even a hypothetical metropolitan area, and use that as a way to come up with a realistic schedule for completing a plan at a metropolitan level or a scenario.
So this draft was based on thinking that you would be able to use a lot of what had previously gone before. And if, as you're talking with some of the other staff in that region or elected leaders, you're concluding you would have a fair amount work to do, let us know. And I think those draft deadlines would be adjusted to reflect that.
Well, I mean, Matt, the previous scenario really had no land use in it, unless I'm missing something.
That's very good information. Thank you.
So, I mean, if I'm wrong about that, we can, and again, if we can talk offline about this too. But that's my recollection, is that we didn't really delve into land use, and it was really a much more broader exercise of looking at, like I said earlier, like what's turning up the knob on things like, or the dial on things like amount of transit service, what's the bike mode share, what's the percentage of electric vehicles in the fleet, how many, what percentage of employees have TDM at their workplace, or people that get TDM at home. I mean, it was more policy, it was a policy oriented scenario. So if we're moving away from that kind of a scenario plan, I think that's a big change. Again, I'm not against that, but I think we need to talk more about what that means from a process perspective.
All right, thank you, Rob and Matt. And just looking at the time, I think we'll ask others to submit any of your comments and questions on this through the survey, but really appreciate it and realize that that conversation was shorter than we were hoping for. Always too much to cover. With that, let's move into our next steps and wrap up. So your next meeting is on February 22nd from 1 to 4. And of course, you'll have the survey link to provide your additional comments. And I'll turn it over to Bill or Kevin with that survey deadline, and if you have any other next steps here.
Yeah, so that survey will be coming out soon. And I'll be working, Kevin and I will work with Ingrid to make sure that gets sent out to the entire RAC. Like Cody mentioned earlier, we've been very pleased with what we've received so far from the advisory committee. So thank you very much. We do read through those, and it's a lot, but it's all very good. So we're very happy to receive that. And so that'll be coming out again based on those key questions worksheet that you got in your packet. So look for that sometime this week, pretty soon here.
Thanks, Bill. And Kirsten.
Kevin, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if Kevin was going to add anything there, but there's one thing up at the every mile counts level that I failed to mention earlier in the equitable outcomes. So as you know, ODOT's on the call today, a very close partner in this work. In addition, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and the Oregon Department of Energy are all working to implement Governor's Executive Order 2004. So at that every mile counts project level, Amanda and Brian have been working, and some of you on the call have participated, so thank you, with a work group on guiding principles for all 4 efforts. And then also the equitable outcomes. We're a bit fortunate because we're ahead of the game with you all's work. So the equitable outcomes you do here are essentially the equitable outcomes for the every mile counts work plan for this item. But I just wanted to let you know that some guiding principles for all 4 agencies' effort is coming forward. So I just want you to be surprised, like, what's this now? Or does this rulemaking had such a tight timeline that we're sort of ahead of that rubric. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And Commissioner Lilac, any words to kind of close us out here?
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks everyone. And Steve and Amanda, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciated your contributions to the meeting. So thank you very much for joining us. I heard so many great ideas, questions, clarifications, really legitimate concerns on all sides of these issues. It was really, I think a powerful conversation today. And clearly we have a lot of work ahead of us. There's a lot that we need to do be it with subcommittees, translating your ideas into the next round of documents for all of this. It's a ton of work. And as Kirsten mentioned, the agency is really stretched in a lot of different ways. And at the same time, our commission, as it's clearly reflected in our very first charge, take action with a sense of urgency and lasting programmatic response as mandated in the governor's executive order, because we need to address climate change and equity in this state and to do it as quickly as possible. Now, with that said, sometimes we have to start slow to go fast, and we don't. We want to make sure that we get it right, and your input is so critical to that. I'm the broken record. Please complete the survey. It's genuinely so valuable to us. And one of the questions and the issues that came up so many times were about the performance standards and are they right? And clearly they're not. We need to view them through the equity lens or through the lived experiences lens. So many of those areas. I really, really encourage you to think about those. And you don't have to have a perfect proposal for what they are. Just have the concept. Our team, the DLCD team, a smaller group, can help translate your ideas into those performance standards for us to bring back, because that's going to be so critical in how we measure the success of this entire project. The other thought I had was, we're talking about so many investments into public infrastructure and bike lanes and all these other things. And then of course, I look out my window and I'm in Bend, and I also think we also need to maintain it once it's in place, because right now we have snow in our bike lanes and on our sidewalks. In Portland, you may be getting it tomorrow. So I think it's going to be important for us to maintain it as well. So I wish everyone the very best. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in less than a month. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thanks to everyone for your wonderful participation. See you on February 22nd, and meeting adjourned.